Hello and welcome to the New Lines podcast. I'm Faisal Al Yafai, and this is a podcast where we delve into some of the biggest ideas, events, and personalities in the Middle East and beyond. Today, I'll be talking to two journalists about their essays for New Lines on a shared theme: how art and archaeology can be used for political purposes. Later in the show, I'll be talking to Olivia Snaije, who wrote an essay entitled "Archaeology Turns Political to Benefit a Trio of Middle East Strongmen." Olivia is a Paris-based journalist who's been investigating how three political leaders, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, and Hafez al-Assad in Syria, built their regimes on the back of archaeology, and how they each used their country's respective heritage to unify their nations, to glorify their rule, and to justify the oppression of their enemies. But first, I'm joined by Lydia Wilson, a contributing editor here at New Lines. Lydia is a research associate at the University of Cambridge's Computer Lab, an editor for the Cambridge Literary Review, and the presenter of the BBC series The Secret History of Writing. She's the author of the essay In a Sea of Broken Glass, Beirut Museums Work to Preserve Their Antiquities, which she wrote in August, a year after the Beirut port blast. Lydia, welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
So we've talked about memory wars and the weaponization of history on this podcast before, but today we're talking about just how far back those battles can go. And the two articles we're talking about really are about how you tell the story of a nation and the role that history in the form of art or archaeology plays in that. So your article was about how Beirutis are uniting to try to rescue the city's antiquities after the Beirut blast. And Snaige's essay was about how Middle Eastern dictators use their country's heritage to try to, again, unify their countries and shape national identity. So there's a link between these two, isn't there, in terms of how history is connected to a sense of identity and how the stories we tell about the past are also stories we tell about ourselves today.
Absolutely. I think it's a very human impulse, in fact, to look at the past to shape our collective identity, whatever that collective identity is, as a family or a community or a nation. And I think that's always happened in the past, probably more through oral culture and perhaps more of a mixture of mythology and what we might call historical fact.
Yeah.
And that hasn't ever stopped. And I think as well, what is common throughout human history is that certain people have utilized that to tell particular stories, to shape that past, and the oral nature of that made that very easy. I think that
that's changed a bit, hasn't it? Now, I mean, we've talked before about the professionalization of history.
Yes, absolutely. That changed a lot of things, I should think, partly because we also saw the institutionalization of a lot of these disciplines. And with that institutionalization came museums and a very tangible sense of history. I think in previous cultures, it's probably been much more oral based. And therefore, we didn't really have this connection to objects in the same way. There might be objects within families, but not so much shared within a society. And now, we're taken to them as children, we're shown them on television. There's very much more an object-based approach. And I think that's probably changed our attitude as well to the sort of fact-based approach to it. If we see it, we kind of think it's real in some way that maybe a story isn't.
Yeah. That's a big shift, I think. I mean, you touch on, we were talking about writing in your BBC series, you touch on that sort of shift in how it changes really the human experience. And I think there's something very similar with objects. I mean, once you have the professionalization of history, as you say, the physical, tangible object in front of you, it gets imbued with a meaning that goes beyond words.
Yes, that's right. And I think also it's more able to be shared. You know that other people have observed this or in the past used this object. And so you see yourself in a shared horizon of history. Which I think is important. But I think there's something else going on specifically at this historical moment, and that's a lot of the anxiety coming out of globalization, that a lot of people are fearing that their cultural specificity is being lost and being encroached on by others. And there's a lot of sense of maybe cultural imperialism. And I think more and more people are are retreating into smaller identities. I've seen this very personally here in Britain and in a post-Brexit world. A lot of what drove that Brexit vote were very nationalistic stories, myths, histories, at the expense of other sorts of identity. And I think partly that comes from an anxiety that we retreat into an identity that seems somewhat safe or solid or nostalgic, that to link us to our ancestors in some way.
And that's very important, because a lot of the way that link is done is through these objects, through the retelling of narratives about what people see around them in buildings, what they have in their museums, and so on.
Absolutely, yes. And those narratives, though, they can be hijacked, they can be retold in all sorts of different ways, not necessarily in bad ways. I think it's one of the myths that history is unchanging, that we have this truth as academics or researchers. We can find this one single truth, when, of course, historians full well know that history is a process, and a historian's work is never done. I mean, I think we've seen this in the culture wars, where the anti-woke brigade accuse people of so-called rewriting history, when they're trying to get rid of oppressive statues or other sorts of heritage. That actually a historian's job is to retell history. That's what we do. And that will never, ever stop. It's not like we now know things about, say, Julius Caesar or I don't know, Darwin. We don't stop. Everybody's still studying these periods of history. And that's because of a few different reasons. First of all, sometimes we get more evidence from the past. We find a new manuscript or a new object. But also we have new brains coming along with new interpretations and new ideas. And so this work of interpretation continues to revise how we understand the past.
So in some ways, that retelling of the national myth through artifacts is very normal. You'd expect every society to try to do it. But before we get into the detail of that and talk a lot about these identities in a shifting world, I want to talk about the specific examples of how these three Middle Eastern politicians use their historical artifacts to try to tell a national story. As you said, it is very normal for historians to try to tell and retell a national story. But what happens when politicians seek to do that for their own ends? Olivia Snaije spoke to me from Paris about her essay, and I started by asking her what first made her interested in the uses and abuses of archaeology.
Well, it was a long process. There's been a lot in the news about restitution and looting of antiquities and so on. And I wanted to do something on Middle Eastern artifacts, antiquities. And so I pitched the story to New Lines. But then when I began to sort of research it, I realized it was a huge topic and I had to narrow it down. And so I began talking to a few archaeologists, and I was speaking to Morag Kersel, who's an archaeologist and anthropologist at DePaul University in Chicago. And we were talking about nationalism and dictators. And she said, it'd be interesting to read something about Gaddafi, for example, or others. So I sort of took the trio, even though they're different, and I started researching it. But it was kind of long and a long process. Yeah,
it's a big subject, this sort of use of archaeology for political purposes. I think you talk about these three, Libya, Syria, and Iraq, and there are some parallels between them, because they were all seeking to shape this national identity in the guise of their own personality, their own political personality, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that Syria and Iraq were more similar because they were, the Ba'ath parties, and the leaders had somewhat, they were less unstable, than Gaddafi, who was quite unique in his way of going about his particular form of nationalism.
They were the Syrian and the Iraq example were really nation building projects, where Libya, I think, was more a Gaddafi building project. It was really much more in his image and with his own political interests and his own historical interests, as you say in the essay.
Yeah, exactly. I think that it depends on their intention and, how they wanted to use archaeology and how the archaeologists collaborated with them. As the Iraqi, the Ba'ath Party at the beginning, they were very sort of intent on Arabness and so on. But then when Saddam Hussein came around, he sort of refined and changed the model a little bit. And it was very important for him, as I said in the article, being a Sunni and a Shia majority, to sort of emphasize the unity of Shia and Sunni being together. And that's why he used Babylon, which was also geographically at the center.
I mean, the nation building aspect of it is really the essence of it. And you say in your essay that one of the main advantages that a country's ancient heritage can offer, particularly in Syria and Iraq, is that heritage is cross-confessional. And when you have these countries where there's a lot of religious diversity, it's easy to see why these rulers would want to have a secular national myth that can unify these faiths and sects, particularly when they're sort of rebuilding the nation.
Exactly. I mean, in Syria, that's a case in point, where, for example, this French academic Stéphane Walter, he wrote a whole book about how Syrian nationalism was built, and he talks about how the Umayyad period was particularly useful to Assad because it was multi-ethnic, and so Assad needed to bring together all these ethnicities and religions under a sort of Arab cover, with a pinch of nationalist pride, a bit of Islam, so as not to put off the majority, and, keep the Christian stuff because they were allied with the Alawites. So it wasn't simple. And this is how they used the archaeology.
I mean, that's why, from one perspective, you look at it and you say, well, there's a certain logic to it. It's not inherently a bad idea to try to use the archaeology to try to build a national myth. The difficulty is that these leaders were using it to build a story from their own political perspective. So they had to sideline a lot of it. And you give exactly the example of Saddam Hussein trying to downplay the Sunni Shia division at the time and focus on a shared Mesopotamian-inspired culture. But then, of course, he was the one who was exacerbating the Sunni Shia divide. Exactly.
The archaeologist Haider al-Mamori said that there's a place in Iraq, the ancient site of, I'm probably mispronouncing it, but Dur Kurigalzu, and it was built by kings in the Kassite dynasty in the second half of the second millennium BC. And it was a huge seat of power in Mesopotamia, but the kings probably came from the Zagros Mountains in what is today Iran. So his archaeologists worked on the site and the period was acknowledged, but he definitely wouldn't have wanted people to know that the dynasty originally came from Iran. That was
and that's the interesting bit about what gets remembered. You have all these three countries that you talk about, Libya, Syria, and Iraq. They're all countries with thousands of years of history. I mean, that example from the second millennium BC, there's such a long, unbroken history in these countries. But the history that these political figures in the 20th century are interested in seems to be from very specific periods of time. And they sideline other periods, they neglect them, they intentionally forget them. So I guess the question for you is, what is it that makes some periods more usable politically than others?
Yes, well, I already mentioned in the case of Syria, the Umayyad culture, which was very useful to them. Again, in Syria, Jewish antiquity and identity was downplayed, and groups of, for example, Ismaili culture were sidelined, and also the more recent Ottoman buildings to step away from the idea that it had been dominated, Syria, by the Ottoman Empire. And in the case of Saddam, I'm not sure if he purposefully damaged layers of culture or if it was simply, a bad job with archaeologists who were too afraid to oppose what he wanted. I mean, there are plenty of examples of him sort of removing layers of civilization, But I'm, again, not an archaeologist and not an expert, so I wouldn't know if he did this purposefully or if it was just, shoddy work. I mean, the archaeologist in Iraq told me that he was recently excavating at the temple of Enlil, and he found an inscription in the holy room that read, this temple was rebuilt in 1989 by order of Saddam. So Saddam couldn't resist putting his mark on everything, It was,
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that comes across in the essay, that actually, for example, Saddam Hussein put a lot of money into archaeology and into restoration projects. And that's, I mean, when you compare it to the current situation, that's a positive thing. But then the reasons for doing it are politically motivated.
Yes, absolutely.
So some of these projects get restored, which they wouldn't have done otherwise. But as they are restored, as you say with that example, there's a little bit of Saddam Hussein put in there to stay for posterity.
No, a lot of Saddam Hussein put in there. Yeah.
And then I guess also, how do they, when they are trying to use these artifacts, I mean, how do they draw the distinction between what the historians are telling them and what they would like that history to say? So the example you gave in the essay is about Libya, and how Gaddafi would sideline the Greek and Roman exhibits because he linked them to the Greek colonization, the Byzantine colonization, the Italian colonization, like that.
Well, I mean, in the case of Gaddafi, I think the best line was the Libyan archaeologist who said it was just a reflection of his unstable character. I mean, there was no real benefit for Gaddafi to sort of sidelining Libya's heritage, except that he wanted to develop the socialist republic, and archaeology wasn't part of his plan. And he didn't develop tourism because he didn't have to. He had oil. And as you said, he was obsessed with colonialism and Italian oppression. And he thought that the amazing Greek and Roman archaeology heralded Italian colonization in the 20th century, even if it was founded in the 7th century BC.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there were so many stories that Mohammed Ali Fakroun, this is the Libyan archaeologist, told me. For example, there was a bronze statue of the Emperor Septimius Severus of Leptis Magna that was made during the Italian occupation, and it was in the central square of Tripoli. But Gaddafi didn't like it. So he said, take it away. So they put it in storage. And then he said to them, well, if Septimius Severus is from Leptis Magna, then he should go to Leptis Magna. And so they had to send the statue there, but it was a modern statue, So, I mean, it was one of the more amusing anecdotes of.
I wondered, actually, it made me think about the very notion of authenticity. I mean, how you tell the stories really of these countries, these complicated countries, in a way that remains authentic to the facts.
I mean, this is the problem when you think about. I mean, it must have been so difficult for Syria, for example, where they had Akkadians, Assyrians, Nabateans, Palmyrians, Canaanites, Hittites, everyone, you name it. And so, I mean, a parallel to me, it would seem a little bit like. I don't know if you remember those films you saw when DNA tests started becoming available, and you'd have a person saying they were sure they were 100% British or whatever. And then they'd get the test back and they'd discover they were also, Jewish, Black, or some other ethnicity.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's impossible. It's impossible. It's an impossible exercise. And
is it an impossible exercise at all? Because, I mean, there is a logic to seeking to integrate the memory of a people into the current modern story. But I wondered if you could say why it's so difficult to do it. I guess the reason is you must have some overarching political structure. Otherwise you just have all these disparate parts and you can't pull them together.
Yes, it's true. I mean, I live in France, and France is one of the few countries that have been able to really pull together and have a real sort of unity. Because if you look at Germany or Italy or Britain, for example. There's still, there's a unity, but they're very regional still. So I think it's with a sort of democratic discourse, it's possible to have unity, but not always possible to sort of have a situation like we do in France.
It's not easy to you have to have a unifying political structure, but inevitably something gets left out of it. There's no possible way to thread all of the different parts. I mean, an old country like France, it's not possible to thread all of the different history into one narrative. You inevitably have to leave some parts out.
Yes, I agree. And I mean, you would have people from Brittany, up in arms. The Corsicans are still, they don't like to be identified as French, but nonetheless, a huge amount of pressure was put on them. Yeah.
And of course, you still see this. I mean, you see it in the UK with Scotland. You see it in Spain with Catalan and so on. So these are still very real problems. They're not necessarily a problem. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Sorry.
No, finish, please.
No, I was just going to say that I don't think what these Arab leaders did really is very different from what's been done all over the world. I mean, for example, under Hitler, you had him sending German archaeologists across Eastern Europe looking for Germanic sites that would be classified as Aryan, and then that would justify the expansion of the Reich across what he would call then ancient Germany.
And even Aryan was itself a creation.
Exactly. And there's an excellent book that I used for research called Archaeology Under Fire. And there's a chapter on former Yugoslavia and, the tensions that there were between the various ethnicities that often resulted in destruction. You have Cyprus with the Greeks and the Turks. I mean, you can look anywhere and find examples of this.
Yeah, I mean, we have a forthcoming essay by Riada Asimovic-Akyol very much about this, about the uses of music in the Balkans, where people claim different parts of their heritage and say, well, this is ours, when actually it's in some way shared between all the different communities.
Yeah,
in your research then, how do you feel that these countries were successful about the nation building? Do you think that they managed it? Do you think they succeeded in it?
From what I understand, from speaking to the Syrian archaeologist Ali Othman, in the case of Hafez al-Assad, he used his sites as a political tool with foreign countries. In other words, he would keep the sites open to foreign archaeologists if their country would do X for Syria. And this worked to a certain extent because the sites in Syria are so rich. And unlike Saddam, Assad was far less flamboyant and didn't integrate his image into the sites. So they were well preserved and well excavated. Whereas in Saddam's case, you did have this dictator who was inserting himself into the archaeological sites and doing damage to them in the process. But ultimately, I think in both cases, people in Iraq and Syria had the notion that they were from countries with an incredible heritage and that culture was important. So that was certainly emphasized, although the nationalistic side to it was more dangerous. In the case of Libya, it was very different because although Gaddafi had studied history, he kind of wiped the slate clean, and children weren't taught history. They were just taught his version of history. So he kept people stuck in a time warp. And the redeeming factor, as a British archaeologist told me, was that his archaeological sites were preserved in benign neglect because at least he didn't destroy any of them. But people weren't educated about their heritage or taught to preserve it. And the Directorate of Antiquities tried to do it a little bit on the sly, but there's a lot of work to be done now in terms of education. So Libya was a case, apart.
Yeah, when you remove the education of those antiquities, what you're really doing, as as your the person you quote in your essay, the Iraqi historian Zainab Bahrani. She said, it's a way of wiping out the memory of a people, because if you don't have that architecture, the people's sense of self can't be tied to anything, and in the end, it's wiped.
Yes, exactly. And you have this delicate balance between, learning about your heritage and then falling into nationalism. So it's the same thing we were saying before. I mean, the borders are not fixed, and yet you have to have some kind of idea of country and past.
Lydia, you touched on a lot of the themes that Olivia mentioned in your essay about preserving Lebanon's antiquities after the blast. For those who haven't read the article, can you give a brief overview of the rescue effort?
Yes, of course. I mean, the blast in the port last August is now widely seen as one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history. I mean, it was huge. It was heard 300 kilometers away in Cyprus. And part of that was that it shattered every single window within a approximately 10-kilometer radius, though there were no windows left in Beirut. And so that was marked in two very different ways. For a start, everybody comments that was the sound of the days after the blast, was the tinkling of broken glass as it was being swept up, whether that was in homes, on the streets, it just everywhere was covered in glass. And the second major effect of that is that there was no glass left. Lebanon has no glass producing factories, so everything had to be imported. There just wasn't enough glass to fix that much destruction. And of course, in closer to the blast was very much more damage. A lot of structural damage. Buildings were knocked down, doors, everything. So much destruction. And one of the marked things that happened was that volunteers flocked to help. People came onto the streets to help each other fix what was broken. And one thing I was very interested in those very first few days was that people were desperate to try and save Beirut's heritage. And there are a number of different reasons for that. I mean, people love Beirut, and especially Beirutis. I think lots of people love the city that they come from. So there was that sense of trying to save the city that had seen so much destruction in its recent past already, largely because of the civil war. And also there's a real sense that that's what Lebanese people share. They share their history, no matter the fractures in the society from the civil war or before or since. There is one thing that really does unite them, and that's their long, very long history. It's the first place humans went after they left Africa, was into that Fertile Crescent. And so the human record, the archaeological record, is really very long indeed.
Well, this is something that the curator Nadine Panayot said to you in the article, that it's the heritage, the reason they were so keen to preserve it is that it's a common ground for this common Lebanese identity. She said, how can you put 18 confessions into a single identity? Meaning, how can you put 18 faiths into one Lebanese identity? This is a quote. That can't happen through religion, but it can through heritage. And that's something that we truly have in common. And that's one of the reasons that you were talking about how so many people came out to give up their time in the midst of so much destruction. No doubt they had their own issues, but they came out to try to save the heritage of the country. And they did so because they felt that if they didn't, in some way, the country itself would be diminished.
Absolutely. That's exactly right. The volunteers spanned society. They spanned all the sects. They were different ages. They came from different communities. They came from different educational backgrounds, but they were unified in this identity and this desire to really preserve that deep past. And of course, yes, Nadine is the director at the AUB Archaeological Museum, and that suffered huge damage because it was so close, but also because so many of her artifacts were made out of glass. So it wasn't just the windows of her museum that were broken, it was the display cases, and then it was artifacts inside going back to the Roman period. And so yeah, this I mean, all of them reported, all of the directors, curators, archivists that I spoke to reported how different this huge army of volunteers made to them, not just because there was so much work to be done, cleaning and clearing and piecing together, but because it was such a moral support. They felt, no, this is important. What we do is important.
I mean, that's something, I think that's a place where we can delineate a difference between what Olivia was writing about, because the experience with Saddam in Iraq and in Libya and in Syria was really a top-down model of heritage. And that's not the case in Lebanon. There, it's not one person trying to use antiquities to bolster their own position. There, it's Lebanese citizens trying to rescue their own history. I wonder if you think the Lebanese would have shown the same enthusiasm to resuscitate their heritage if it had been more top down, if those objects were associated with a particular government narrative. Would they have expended the same effort to try to save them?
Oh, well, that is very interesting. Yes, it is a marked difference. This was a very much bottom-up response to the tragedy. And in fact, what was remarkable about the government in this situation is that they were totally absent. They didn't help at all. They were not cleaning up the glass or rescuing the museums. I'm not sure if the individuals would have felt differently had they been involved. I think there was widespread anger that they were not. But I think it is something very, very specific to Lebanon, that there is no shared telling of recent history whatsoever. The school books stop at 1975 when the Civil War started.
Yeah.
There is no unified narrative of the Civil War in any museum or book. That nobody's ever done any national telling of that story. It has been done by sect. You hear about it from your family. You don't hear about it from any sort of central source. And so yes, it is. It's kind of the opposite situation to the three that Olivia was talking about, but shows the same need for a shared identity, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I thought that came across in my conversation with Olivia, that to some degree, you do need to do this retelling of the national story for the particular political moment. But it's how you do it. I mean, as you say, in Lebanon, they've had a very unique history, and because of the horrors of the Civil War, the history stops. As you say, it stops in the mid-70s. And if you want to understand what happened, there isn't a national narrative. Heritage, to some degree, provides a refuge for that, because you can reach back far into history. You don't need to talk about the 20th century to talk about being Lebanese. You can talk about all the centuries that preceded it. I wonder if you feel, though, that at a certain point, you will need, in that country, you will need to tell the heritage story up to the 20th century and into the 21st.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think it's very necessary for an identity to interpret the present as well as the past. And of course, we're preserving it for future historians as well, because this work of interpretation doesn't stop. So in a way, there's past, present, and future in all of these efforts. And I think a national narrative of the 20th century is something that a lot of Lebanese people have been fighting for in a number of different ways. But without that political will, it's very difficult to have something truly national. And I think another of the problems is not just how you tell these stories, but who you involve. In a lot of post-conflict zones, we've seen citizen engagement with telling this story. We've had oral histories and retellings through art, through theatre, through journalism, and people have been brought together to tell conflicting stories. Well, this isn't how I remember it, and that's very noticeably absent in Lebanon.
I mean, you already have that process of seeking to retell history. For example, in Iraq, in the post-Saddam era, you have the majority, as it were, the Shia, who were treated as a minority, now become the majority, and now they start to talk about the history of the 20th century, but they talk about it from their own perspective, in exactly the same way as you say, the various sects in Lebanon seek to do seek to retell their own national story through their own experiences. But the difficulty comes with seeking a common way of telling that story. And I wonder, I think this came through with the Olivia interview, I wonder if there is such a way. I mean, doesn't it need a overarching political theory? Otherwise, how can you take all of these disparate parts of history and put them together, string them along like a necklace, beads on a necklace? How can you possibly tell one particular story?
Well, history, I think historians have acknowledged that isn't what we can do ever. We can't come up with a coherent, linear, neat narrative. There are too many conflicting sources from the past. And even from the present, you ask three people what happened in a bar brawl, they're not going to come up with the same story. This is what humans are like. We are imperfect in how we reconstruct events. And so something as complex and emotional and laden as a civil war is going to be the same. So it's not as if I don't think anyone would think you could come up with a nice, neat textbook saying this is what happened A, B, C, but you need to put the competing accounts all together and acknowledge there isn't one truth, and acknowledge that there is a huge emotional content to all of this. And that would go some way towards building a common consensus.
Can I take it from that then that you don't believe the existence of art or artifacts or archaeology is sufficient for a national story? That you do believe there has to be an element of politics, of selection of what the stories mean?
It's not so much about selection, it's about acknowledging a plurality, I think is how I'd put it, and acknowledging the role of interpretation. And so whoever you get to write an account, a narrative, you acknowledge that that is one particular brain doing that work, and other people would have put it together slightly differently. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. That's just acknowledging the limits of history and saying what we do is we do it many times, and we use many different people, and we use different lenses to look at the past, and we put them all together. And it's like a mythology. You know, there's no one way of telling the Greek myths. People have been retelling them for millennia, but they always contain the same sorts of kernel, and we read them for different reasons, and we acknowledge the power of different forms.
I wonder, though, if you are talking about this reinterpretation of history in a gentle way, when actually the reinterpretation of history can be very violent. I mean, you started talking at the beginning about the role of what is sometimes called the woke movement and Black Lives Matter, and the retelling of, for example, Britain and America's history. That is incredibly divisive. I mean, it's not violent. It hasn't turned violent yet, but it is an incredibly divisive thing. So when you are seeking to reinterpret these what people have thought of up until that point as historical facts, you really are seeking an argument within communities. Sometimes those arguments can turn violent.
Oh, absolutely. It's very ideologically laden. And when it's bound up with identity, there's emotions involved, and emotions drive all sorts of behavior. And of course, with a lot of national identities, certainly in Britain and other Western countries, there's a large amount of white supremacism going on. As I understand it, it seems to be growing, or maybe it was already there and they've been emboldened by leaders such as Trump. But many ways of interpreting the past come with massive amounts of ideology. And then, it leads very directly into, for example, the political assassinations we've been seeing in this country, anti-Semitic or Islamophobic or racist attacks. I absolutely don't deny the potential for violence in interpreting the past.
If we say then that the process of reinterpreting the past is obviously going to be difficult, but you need to hold on to these archaeological and art artifacts in order to allow the current generation, future generations to do so. But then I guess the question is, what do you need that enables that discussion, that wider conversation, to be had in a spirit of understanding? What are the things that you as a historian can say are necessary to allow the story of Iraq, the story of Syria, the story of Libya, and the story of Lebanon, and lots of other places to be told in a way that doesn't exclude communities?
That is a very fundamental and challenging question for all historians and archaeologists, partly because we know what we do involves destruction. Every time you dig into the ground in an archaeological dig, you destroy some of the evidence. It's in the name of preserving and understanding more, but you just have to hope that you are choosing the right thing to dig through and the right thing to put in a museum. Similarly, museums, they do not have infinite space. Curation is an eternal process of selection, of selecting what to preserve and what to display to the public. And that involves a certain amount of discarding. And so what we do, quite apart from the destruction that happens from, well, explosions in the Beirut port or war or conflict or ideological dictators coming along and destroying things, quite apart from all of those things, we know that we are destroying the historical record as we go. What to do for the future then is just do the best we can and document as we go. And this is why there are seeds of hope to be found in such tragedies like the Beirut blast, that the curators and directors who are working so hard to preserve what they can, they are learning lessons as they go, not just in preservation, but also taking advantage of what's happened to their objects to do further research. As Nadine Panoyet said to me, director at the AUB Archaeology Museum, she said, there's no way we would have smashed a Roman vessel to do some chemical analysis on it, but we could do that with the fragments we had. And so she's actually running a workshop to explore what has been learned from the Beirut explosion. And I think with one eye on the future, these sorts of events actually can be used. And so there is hopefully always something to be gained for the future.
Lydia Wilson, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Lydia's essay is on our website. It's called "In a Sea of Broken Glass, Beirut Museums Work to Preserve Their Antiquities." And Olivia's essay can be found at Archaeology Turns Political to Benefit a Trio of Middle East Strongmen. Lydia is on Twitter at LSM Wilson, and Olivia is at Olivia Snaije. And of course, you'll find more essays, podcasts, and our new Middle East Digest newsletter called Turjuman on our website, newlinesmag.com. Thank you all for joining us.